Hi, and welcome to the TCBC Bible Read Along program. A little hard to say. Whole Bible in a Year plan. We are really glad that you have decided to follow this plan, and I'm going to be here to help you along the way. I'm John Weatherly, Associate Pastor. We're going to be giving you some tips about your reading each week. First of all, let's talk about some general strategies for reading. I want to encourage you to read the Bible with openness and curiosity. Don't expect to understand everything. It's not a failure if you think, oh, this doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Just keep reading. A lot of things will become clearer as you go along, but primarily we're trying to get a large view of the Bible, see how the parts fit together into the whole. So every detail is not going to be important there. Set aside your expectations and your preconceptions. We are going to realize that sometimes these texts are discussing things other than what we think that they're talking about. That the Bible is sometimes aiming us in a direction other than maybe where we might expect it to go. Imagine yourself as a part of the place and the time of the people who received these texts at the beginning. The Bible was written for all of us, but it was written to the ancient people of Israel in the Old Testament and the early followers of Jesus in the New Testament. So keeping that in mind and using our sanctified imaginators to kind of put ourselves in their situation is a way that we can understand these texts more along the lines of what God is saying to us in them. And as we do this, look for the big picture, as I said a moment ago. I want to give you 6 words to help organize that. The story of the Bible begins with creation, that God creates a good world. But that leads to corruption. Human beings who are put in the world to be God's vice regents, to rule the world with God, rebel against God, and because of that bring a curse upon themselves and upon the world in which they live. God promises in a covenant, that's our third word, to make the world right again. And that's really the 3-part story of the Old Testament that begins in Genesis, where our reading is going to begin. When we'll come to the New Testament, we'll see how Christ brings fulfillment to that covenant. Our 4th word. The 5th word is the church, the followers of Jesus, who are following his teachings and being his salt and light in the world. And this leads ultimately to completion, when Christ's promised return happens and he rules fully as the world's king, having made things right. Well, this week we're going to begin at the beginning with the book of Genesis, and you're going to read almost half of the book of Genesis, chapters 1 to 24. In this we'll see the story of creation, as we've mentioned. We'll see how God allows humans to be put to the test in terms of their trust in him, and when they're tested, they fail. And as a result of that, they are in rebellion against God, wanting to run the show themselves, and the curse comes upon them. But in the midst of that, God makes a promise. The seed of the woman will crush the head of the snake. Well, from there, we'll see how the problem of human rebellion just continues generation after generation. It'll get so bad that we'll think we need a do-over. And so God does something that looks like a do-over with Noah and his family. But by the time we come to the end of that story, we realize this do-over isn't working because we need a better solution than that. And the first part of Genesis is going to end with the story of the Tower of Babel, which is a kind of a bringing together of the human ambition to rule the world in a human empire that exalts humanity. But what we see in that is that what that results in is simply tribalism and rivalry and misunderstanding. One of the Psalms we're going to read this week, Psalm 2, is going to speak to that. Why do the nations rage and the peoples imagine a vain thing? It's like it's describing the world that we live in. It's like it's telling us about the story of the Tower of Babel. Well, God's answer to the conflict among the nations is to bless the nations. And that's where the story of Abraham comes in. God says to Abraham, despite the fact that you are an old childless man, I'm going to make your descendants a great nation. And they are going to, by you, I'm going to bless all the nations of the world. And so we'll see the story of Abraham emerging. Abraham himself is a problematic guy. He rebels against God, sometimes with good intentions. But ultimately, when his faith is put to the test, when his trust is put to the test, he is going to trust God even at the hardest. All right, now along the way, we're going to be reading the Psalms. You'll see Psalm 1 is going to speak about what it means to obey God, to trust God. But then Psalm 2 was going to talk about human rebellion, but God's promise to fix that. And then Psalms 3 through 7 will remind us of how the faithful cry out to God in the midst of a sinful world. Well, enjoy your reading, and May the Lord bless you in this interesting task.